Perfect. As I said, everyone, just please keep those cameras and microphones off. We will have time for questions at the end of the presentation tonight. Well, welcome to our first lecture of the year. While I know many of us had hoped to have the general start to the year event as we have in previous times, COVID as always has thrown a spanner in the works and led us to be a bit more creative with how we approach 2022. I would first like to extend my thanks to Steve Turton for putting the time in to prepare this presentation and to give it to us today. And we really do look forward to what will be presented. As always, everyone, you're welcome to this meeting. I hear as well we have a few guests on the line tonight as well. The RGSQ is a fantastic organisation and our lecture program a key part of that. If you want to gain access to the lecture program throughout the rest of the year, got a great lineup already in place. Please make sure to hop across to the RGSQ website and look at how you can join, as well as some of the activities and other events that we'll be hosting for the year. So tonight we have with us Dr. Steve Turton, who many of you would know as one of our counsellors here at RGSQ, a previous JP Thompson medalist. And as you can see up on the screen, the independent chair of the Wet Tropics Waterways Partnership. So tonight, Steve has kindly put some time in to deliver to us a fascinating, I've been told, presentation about regional waterways health report cards. And will be helping give us a few insights into how these are assisting in the Wet Tropics region. Steve, I won't steal any more of your thunder and throw straight to you.
Yeah, thank you, John. And it's great to be here this evening and actually the first talk of the year. And I think it's going to be a great seminar series this year for the Society. So I look forward to actually listening to some of the presentations over the next 12 months. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Cubby Cubby and Jinnabara people of the Sunshine Coast where I live, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. I'd also like to acknowledge a couple of people in the audience I've noticed who popped in. We've got Simon Constanza. You'll see his name coming up tonight. He's a bit of a guru when it comes to report cards. So I'm hoping he can ask some difficult questions a bit later on. I'd also acknowledge James Donaldson from the Wet Tropics Waterways Partnership. He is our executive officer. So, and also family and friends and members of the Society. It's great to be here. So I thought this is a good opportunity to talk to the Society about the Regional Waterways Health Report Cards for the Great Barrier Reef. First of all, I want to cover this evening, what are they? What exactly is a report card for a waterways, for a catchment or basin? And how do we use these to bring around change management, in particular focusing on the Great Barrier Reef catchments? The reason being that the Great Barrier Reef, of course, is a global icon. It's a World Heritage Site. It's been in the news a lot lately around coral bleaching. There are issues around water quality entering the Great Barrier Reef lagoon. It's estimated to be worth $54 billion as an asset, and it brings in around $12 billion a year through and employs 64,000 people. Obviously, the last year or so, the tourism has been affected, but generally speaking, that's the sort of level of employment that rely on the Great Barrier Reef, not just in tourism, but also in fisheries and other industries. So I'll get right on to it. How does this work? Okay, you'll see this name Costanza here. He's a very good looking gentleman that you can't see because he's turned off his camera from some of his work. So I thought I'd start off by just saying, let's just do a bit of geography here. What is a river basin? So this is from a book that was put together. And this is the Orinoco Basin in South America. You can see in the top map there. And it's a transboundary basin, Colombia and Venezuela. And of course, it's an interesting catchment or basin because it drains off very old landscapes. And the Amazon Basin, the northern branch of it, actually starts just down here. And that's the black water that goes down and mixes with the water that comes off the Andes that is white water. And a city called Manaus, the two mix together. So that's how we kind of think of a river basin. It's determined by topographic features. So the other thing that I think is useful for us to get thinking about report cards is, I'm an academic. I very much work in this bottom space, the scientific community. Now, the scientific community here is quite broad. It includes social sciences and humanities and engineering sciences. It's not just science. But we work in a very high density, if you like, information area. And we tend to have very low synthetic information. So very little of our work has been synthesized to be useful to a more broader audience. And that's fine, because our role is to do primary research and to produce read publications, book chapters, and also books. And I guess that's what we do. And this is the bottom of the pyramid, the information pyramid. And then the next level we might think of as being the kind of management community. So in the case of catchments, this will be a lot of the government agencies, some of the NGOs, like the Terrain Natural Resource Management, for example, the people involved in the management side, and also some university work as well that's more applied, that they tend to sort of produce technical documents. So they sort of moved up a little bit in the synthesis information side of things, but it's still fairly high density information. And the next level up, of course, is the stakeholder groups and officials. So again, this could also be terrain NRM, but it could be any number of stakeholders who live in a basin. It could be local government, it could be traditional owners, it could be farmers, could be community groups, landholder groups, those sorts of things. And they're kind of more interested in the summary side of things. So they're moving more into the requiring more synthesis of information and a lot less density of information. They're that sort of green band there. The pyramid, we have where report cards come in. And these are targeting the general public, but also policy decision makers. Now, let's be honest, the average politician probably is not going to read anything down this part of the pyramid. And I doubt if they're even going to read too much further up the pyramid. Certainly their minders will, but they are more likely to focus on looking at a report card, hopefully. And that might hopefully inform decision making and policy making as well. But the general public also want to know about how healthy the waterways are. How healthy are the waterways, in this case, going out into the GBR lagoon. So here we've got a whole bunch of examples of different kinds of report cards. We'll come to those in a moment. So they, if you like, what we're focusing on in this talk is the top of the pyramid, the report card. However, I will go back to talking about, the technical reports that underpin our report cards, because we also produce those as well within the partnership. So again, this is from the same original report. This is kind of in a nutshell the process of going through a report card. And this could be anywhere in the world where you're producing a basin or river catchment report card. You begin by identifying, if you like, what are the basin values and threats. And obviously to do that, you need to be talking to the stakeholders, the people who live in the basin. You don't do a top-down thing about it. And then you need to think about what do we measure. So you need to choose indicators, and we'll talk about that in a moment. And then you need to sort of work with stakeholders, but also with scientists and others to define thresholds for particular indicators as to what is considered to be healthy or not healthy in a waterway. And when I talk about a waterway, I don't just mean where the water's flowing through the landscape, it's the whole landscape, including the land areas as well as the marine, and going through into the marine areas as well. And then the next thing is, how does it all add up? So this is where we've got some sort of development of metrics and calculating scores and determining grades. Very much like a school report, where you have got scores that go behind the grades themselves, A, B, C, D, for example, or HD, D, credit, pass, depending on the grading system. And the last point in the report card process is a very important part. If you go back to that pyramid, it's actually communicating the results to the wider community. So that's the last part. So this is, again, from the Orinoco Basin, and I'll go through a series of steps in a moment, but these are the sorts of indicators that particular communities the stakeholders of the Orinoco Basin came up with. These are the things that are their key values to them. And from that, you can look at what the key threats are as well. Now, these are broken down into almost like triple bottom line, if you like. We've got biodiversity, wholesome indicators there. They got exotic things like river dolphins that we don't have here, and those sorts of things. And they've obviously got monkeys as well. But you've got these different sorts of measures of biodiversity. You've got a whole lot of management governance issues, and some of these are threatening processes around oil and gas, mining pressure, illegal harvest, community involvement, agricultural certification, all those sorts of things. These are multi-use landscapes. They're not all protected in terms of being put away in national park or anything like that, although a lot of them are. And then you've got the economy, so things that are critical for running the economy: river transport, tourism, economic development, and fisheries. Then there's a whole stack of what you might think of as ecosystems and landscapes that are quite separate to the biodiversity side. So some of these are ecosystem services as well. Stable forest area, connectivity in the landscape, which is very important for fauna to move through, land cover change, but also fire frequency. There are fires in here because it's a seasonal climate in this part of South America. So it does get quite dry in the dry season. There's a whole lot of people and cultural kinds of indicators you might be thinking about as well. These include things like human nutrition, indigenous areas. You might notice all of these things, there is a way to actually measure them. I'll come to those in a moment. And of course, water is critical with all of our waterway work. So particularly around water quality, but also connectivity, water supply for people, the quantity of water, seasonal flow. As I said before, it's a seasonal basin, and the risk to water, accessing drinking water and all those sorts of things. So they are really, they make up, if you like, the visualization of the interactions of the environmental, socio-cultural and economic values in that particular basin. And this is another thing that comes from this Costanza et al., not Set al., sorry, that's a typo, report, is that the indicators, how they are chosen and how they are measured are equally important. You'll come to understand that in a moment. So again, you develop metrics to measure these indicators, you score them, and usually in a quantitative way. You then need to think about the thresholds for those indicator scores. So threshold is when you change, if you like, between a grade, between a B and a C, or between a B and an A in a grading system. So they're determined through consultation with stakeholders, but also with various experts as well. So for example, in the water quality space, you probably will need the input of someone who's an expert on water quality, as is someone who's an expert on the biodiversity. But you also need to be consulting with Indigenous people about the cultural values. So once the scores are determined and you've come up with the metrics around them and the thresholds, you can then actually calculate the grades, much like a school report. So this is an example. Again, this is the same Orinoco Basin. You've got the color coding there, and this is a bit like a beer coaster mat, you know, like you get in the bar. That's what we call it anyway. I think that's what it's called. And there's a color coding system. The value in the middle is the overall grade for the basin. It's a B minus. In our report cards, we don't use minuses or pluses. We just use straight grades. It does vary around the world, and you can see that some of the grades are actually in the yellow. They're moderate. Some of them are in the red. Actually, there's no reds in that one, and some are poor, and some are excellent. And I was looking at this, and I would maybe Simon could comment a bit later on. But if you're working a lot, particularly with Aboriginal people in Australia, red actually is a good colour. So we tend to sort of see it as you get a red, like it's a bad grade, but it might actually mean a positive thing. So again, you need to think of those cultural nuances if you're going to be doing this sort of work with traditional owner groups. There might be cultural differences that are significant. And you can see here that these are the different score, they're in these categories, 80 to 100% and so on. So that they are the cutoffs for the scores for the different grade levels. You can also take your report card and you can look at it at the sub-catchment or sub-basin level. So as has been done here. So you get some idea of the spatial patterns of grades across the whole basin. That's another thing that you can do. And you can identify hotspots. So this is obviously a bit of a hotspot here. It's a D+. That's a pretty lousy grade. Something's happening in this part of the catchment. I don't know what it is. It might be a mine. Who knows? But it's causing an issue maybe with water quality or something like that. Okay, the history of report cards. Now, you probably might be surprised to know that report cards started in Brisbane, in Queensland, first in the world. That's why Australia appears up the top here, 1998. And that's Healthy Land and Water. That beginnings in 1998, they began estuarine and marine monitoring in Moreton Bay catchments. And they produced, I understand, the world's first basin report card was launched in 2000. And a number of things came out of that that you can have a look at. And subsequently, there were some decisions made to reverse some of those trends. And we all know the Brisbane River in its heyday was pretty disgusting. It really had really big issues with contamination in its day. But now, of course, it's gradually improving considerably every year. So if you look at this here, you can see the patterns of Australia being world leaders, and then it's moving around and it's been taken up in developing countries a bit later on, all over the world. And this goes through to 2019. So there you go. It's a first not only for Australia, but for Brisbane and for Southeast Queensland. I understand in 2003, they extended the report card to include the northern catchments of the Sunshine. Right, so this is a bit of theory for you tonight. The theory of change, it wasn't written by Simon Costanza as far as I know, but he's referring to it here in the context of a river basin. And the theory of change is very applicable to the work that we do in all of the partnerships. And again, this is a fairly long diagram, but what it's really all about is enacting behavioural change, building capacity so that you can help community groups and stakeholders who are living in river basins or catchments to improve or maintain their shared river health status. So you start off by working with those stakeholders, much like I showed you with that Orinoco example. You've got your communities, your businesses and your governments. In our case, in the wet tropics, our businesses include a fairly significant amount of sugar industry input. They're a big part of the landscape, but also bananas, but also tourism and other kinds of industries, fisheries, for example, aquaculture. And then, of course, you work with governments at all levels, but mostly you're focusing on local government and obviously state, because they're mostly responsible for a lot of those areas. And once you get into the marine areas, you're working with federal government, and you're also working with the communities. And you go through this process. But the idea of this is that you are scaling up, you're focusing in on the top part of the pyramid that I showed you before. So there's a lot of behavioural change involved, there's capacity building, and it's about bringing people together and for a shared vision. I would like to go through this in more detail, but if you're interested in this, feel free to ask me and I can tell you more about it. I will return to it though a bit later in my talk. Okay, so this is cut off from me, but I think it says working towards 2050. Now, the 2050 is essentially the Reef 2050 plan. So there's a bit of a diagram on the right that if you're looking at it for the first time, you'll probably get a bit confused because it's fairly complicated. But all I'm saying is there are a number of report cards out there that to do with the health of the Great Barrier Reef and as a system. We start with, with the, so basically there's a series of report cards. They report on progress towards the Reef 2050 long-term sustainability plan. This has recently been reviewed. There's a heads of government agreement on this because the Great Barrier Reef has both Australian and Queensland government jurisdiction over it. And it's about basically what's the reef going to be like in 2050. So there are a number of report cards that come out. The one at the top here is called the Outlook Report. It comes out every 5 years. It's published by the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority. So it is a federal statutory organisation that produced this report. And the last one was in 2019, and there was a lot of kerfuffle about it because the reef got a grade of poor. It had a poor grade, and that led to some of the hiatus with the UNESCO and World Heritage Committee. So they only come out every 5 years, but once again, they do address it. So that's the science, if you like, in this column. This is planning management, and this is the monitoring side of it. I won't go through all of this because, again, it would take up too much time, but I will just tease out the bits that are important for this talk tonight. So we've got the Reef 2050 plan as the overarching document or policy document and legal document in regard to the health of the reef. So we've got the 5-year report. Now this focuses on the entire GBR region. It reports on all aspects of GBR health. So it reports on a number of aspects of health. And it's quite different to the regional report cards that is the main point of my talk tonight. It reports on condition against set targets. So one of the reasons that the reef got such a poor score, I believe it was an E. Imagine getting an E for your school report. You wouldn't want to take it home to mum and dad, would you? Was that it was just not tracking against expectations against set targets for 2025 and also for 2050. So it wasn't meeting, it wasn't rising to meeting those targets. So that's why it got a low score. It didn't mean the reef was in bad condition. It just meant it was not meeting the targets that it was set to meet. So that's one of the issues when you report on condition against set targets or status against targets. The next report is the Great Barrier Reef Water Quality Report Card, which is, it comes out of the Office of the Great Barrier Reef, but it's essentially it's funded by both federal and state government, and they all work together on it. It focuses mostly on the inshore GBR region, and it reports on the paddock to reef data, which is an initiative of the Department of Environment and Science, Queensland Department of Environment and Science. It also reports on condition against set targets as well. And there have been some issues around that as well that has got some of the farming community pretty sort of wound up too, particularly cane farmers. And where we come in with the regional report cards is that there are 5 regions. We do an annual report card. We do a catchment to reef focus. So we start right up in the upper catchment, if you like, at the Great Divide, and we go all the way through to the outer reef. So we report on all of the full spectrum of habitats and waterway issues, freshwater, right through to estuarine and through to out into the reef systems. But we report on condition only. And obviously over time, we can start looking at trends. Are we seeing improvements in our grades? Are our grades getting worse? So that's quite a different way of reporting. But when they set up these regional report cards, the decision was made, because they were very much a community document. The other two are perhaps not so much a community document, they're more of a government sort of document, was that for the community to buy into them, it would make a lot of sense for us to only report on condition. And that's, you'll see in a moment that doesn't mean we shouldn't look at trends. And we're hoping over time we will see some improvement in the grades. If not, certainly some shifts in the scores behind the grades. So let's have a look at the how all these fit together now. Quick summary. So we've got the reef-wide report card produced by Gravumpa. It's produced every 5 years. It has a strong science focus. It's quite a thick document, very heavily sort of lower down in that pyramid, if you like. And then we've got the Reef Water Quality Report card that is somewhere in the middle there. It's a mix of density, but also openness. People can understand it has those coasters in it showing different scores, for example. But it mainly focuses on inshore reef systems and inshore marine environments like seagrass beds, for example. And it is also an annual report. And down the bottom, we have these 5 regional report cards. So the one on the left is the one that I'm I'm very privileged to be the chair of, the independent chair to the Wet Tropics Waterways Partnership. So here we have another way of looking at all of us. Wet Tropics in the north, you can see is centred around Cairns. I'll zoom in on that a little bit later. We've got another partnership, if you like, a sisters partnership, because we work very closely with the Dry Tropics Partnership, which is focused on the Townsville local government area, but also the offshore marine environment. Mackay-Whitsunday, or it's known as the Healthy Rivers to Reef Partnership, which is the sort of Mackay-Whitsunday Isaac region, and we work very closely with them as well. In fact, the three northern ones, we actually have a very close relationship in a lot of the work we do, including sharing a technical working group, for example. And then we have Gladstone Harbour. This was the first of the GBR report cards, and this was set up after the 2011 floods, and there were a whole lot of issues down there in the harbour, as there were in the Fitzroy River. So the Gladstone Harbour and the Fitzroy partnerships were set up after the 2011 floods, which also flooded Brisbane as well, as you might remember, whereas we came in a little bit later on. Now, there are differences between the partnerships. They have different stakeholders. You know, Fitzroy is has the most coal mines of any basin in Australia, all right? It's centred on, it's got some big coal mining areas. We don't have any coal in the Wet Tropics at all. We're mostly agricultural tourism sort of area and World Heritage, so very different mix. So they are a little bit like apples and oranges. You can't really compare them. You can look at the report cards though, and you can sort of have a look at what's happening there, but there are some differences. And I think, as Simon would agree, the whole point of these regional report cards is that they are for the community, and they should not all be the same, because not all communities are the same. I might point out that we do have some gaps in the GBR network, and at this stage, there's no funding to fill those, unfortunately. Cape York, the Cape York catchments don't have a report card yet, but it might also be they don't have enough data to make a report card, at least the whole of it, right up into the north. However, you can see how close the reef is to the coastline up here. So that makes the reef even more vulnerable to land effects, should they increase over time, if they decide to increase agriculture on Cape York, for example. You might also notice that the Burdekin, second biggest catchment in Queensland, it's not included. And the reason for that is that it just wasn't picked up in that Townsville and that Dry Tropics Partnership. However, there is talk about them developing a report card through the local NRM group. So hopefully we'll see that in the future. Down the southern end of the GBR region, the Mary Burnett basins, closer to Brisbane, but still within the GBR catchment, they do not have a report card yet. However, they are some distance from the reef. It's a lot further out. So there's probably less land issues to be concerned about. But there is talk about them possibly doing one in the future. So what I'll say about each partnership is it focuses on their community's unique needs and has developed products and programs that provide a trusted, independent source of regional and local knowledge. And that's the importance of these regional report cards. They complement those higher level reef-wide report cards that I was talking about. Okay, I better speed up a little bit. Oh no, actually we're okay for time. So what's the sort of difference between these reef-wide versus, I'm not going to talk about the higher level outlook report from Gurumpa, I'm just focusing on the two sets of annual reports. So the reef-wide sort of report that focuses on the inner reef systems. This is an example of that. Their most recent one is the 2019. And this is just their methods chapter. And this is our report card here from last year, the 2021 report card. I think we've got a prettier cover, actually, when I look at it. So what are the main differences between these two? So the reef report card, which is the reef-wide one, it focuses on inshore marine zone, paddock to reef, which is a program of Department of Environment and Science, obviously paddock suggests that they're working with agriculture. It mainly reports on water quality, coral and seagrass. And whereas we report on all of the basins, freshwater, estuaries, inshore and the offshore reefs. We have quite a few partners there, lots of acronyms here, but obviously our partners include research organisations like AIMS, Department of Environment and Science, their research arm, state government, through Paddock to Reef, CSIRO, JCU, particularly Trop Water, the Queensland Department of Resources, the Queensland Regional Development, and I forgot what the M stands for, and Water, and councils. We work quite closely with local government. They have quite a big sort of footprint in our region. I'll talk a little bit about councils a bit later on. They focus on all of the regions, so they kind of scale up a bit, but they only focus on that limited number of indicators, and we focus only on the wet tropics region. So before I move on to talk about the wet tropics region, just a few sort of, going back to the theory of change now. How do you actually make that happen? How do you bring about change and improve waterway health? So we see our partners having a role in the report card. So they provide input in a number of ways, actually. They contribute funding. Obviously, most of our funding comes from the Australian government and the Queensland government, but we do get some funding from local government and some of our other partners, like the sugar industry. But a lot of it's in kind. So some of the small give us water quality data, but they can't actually give us cash, but we're still very happy having that data. They also help confirm the geographic scope. So as I said, our scope is that sort of catchment to reef approach. They can also guide the determination of what is locally and regionally relevant objectives and management targets. You can't do that through a top-down process. You have to work through a bottom-up process through your stakeholder engagement. They also provide data, as I said, and other technical advice. Now, some of our partners are universities, as I said, so they're already sort of providing that lower part of the pyramid, but they also often make it in a form that's useful for us to be able to use in the report card. We also ask them to scrutinise results, scrutinise any messaging that we do, and desire prior to release. So the design side of the report card, we don't just make a decision in-house about that. We ask our stakeholders what they think the design should be and what should be in the report card. We might do a mock-up of it, but then we spend a fair amount of time getting feedback on what's actually in the report card. And you'll see on the right, this is a report card launch up in Cairns. And I'm just showing you that we usually try to drag the odd politician in if we can. On this occasion here, this gentleman on the left is a councillor from Cassowary Coast Regional Council. He's always good for a photo shot, media shot. So at the actual, what we do is partners at the release, they contribute to media statements. We do quite a lot of social media. They participate at the event. And there's also dissemination of results through their organisations and associated groups. So we rely on the peak organisations, such as cane growers, to do the dissemination of our work with their members. We can't reach out to everybody, so we rely on that network to do that. Sharing of results, obviously. When it comes to the post-release, we tend to have follow-up and influence with briefings. We also try to prioritise areas for improvement in the report card and also helping fill the data gap. So every year or so, we're adding more and more layers to our report card. So it's pretty well improving every year. And the other thing that we engage with a lot now is citizen science as well, and involving citizen science projects in providing data for the report card. We arrange special fora and workshops. I'll give you an example of a couple of fora that we've done over the last few years. And on the bottom slide here, we've got one of our staff members who is actually doing a podcast interview. And we often like to do these in the field if we can, unless you're sort of next to under the airport, it's probably not a good thing. But we do try to make it quite authentic by talking to our partners actually in the paddock or in the cane shed or whatever, to try and make it authentic. They're often people are more comfortable talking in their own surroundings. I guess the other thing is that this making change happen is we want our report cards to influence stewardship. We want them to lead to better management outcomes. We want them to lead to improved water health, improved water quality. So, you know, some of this is not necessarily from our group, but the Mackay Whitsunday group, a bit more, they've been around a lot longer than us, but they've undertaken cultural heritage assessments highlighting important traditional owner sites and their management needs. Another example is providing independent assessments of the performance standards being implemented by various sectors, such as the urban stewardship framework and non-agricultural industry assessments. I'll come back to the urban stewardship framework a bit later. And I think, as I said before, increased value of citizen science activity. So we're, for example, involved with Mangrove Watch in the Cairns area on a couple of our river systems in the lower reaches where there are significant mangrove communities. Another example of report cards connecting with management decisions is this is a forum that we hosted back in 2019. So obviously we've had a bit of slowdown in terms of community consultation during COVID, but we snuck this in before COVID. It was an emerging issues in Waterway Health Forum that we ran at CQU in Cairns, and you can see we brought in other sponsors as well. Now, we invited different speakers to talk about emerging issues in waterway health. So one of them is around microplastics. Now, microplastics, I learned something that day. I learned that the average person ingests the equivalent of a credit card of plastic once a week. So that's something to think about. It's a lot. I don't think we necessarily absorb it, but hopefully we pass it through. But even so, that's quite a lot of, maybe that's not a week, it might be a year. Maybe I got that wrong. Anyway, microplastics are an issue in our waterways, as are macroplastics. Another issue is PFAS, particularly around military sites. It's used as a fire retardant in firefighting. Other emerging issues, obviously, invasive species, fish and also plants getting into our waterways is a big emerging issue, particularly from the aquarium trade, where people tip out get sick of their aquarium. Instead of just tipping it on the garden and letting it dry out and die, they tip the weeds or fish into the nearest waterway. It's a big problem up in the wet tropics. Anyway, we looked at a number of these issues at that forum, and it went very, very well. And we had people from not only the area, but also from Canberra and Brisbane who came up to that. We had about 100 people. So these are the kind of things we try to run once every year or so. So some of the shared learnings, I guess, across all of the partnerships is we try to bring this sort of ridge to reef, or creek corals is another term I've heard used. We tend to say ridge to reef. We often try to have local area champions in the different sectors. They're pretty essential. So we've got a couple of cane farmers in our region they're pioneers in what they're doing in terms of improving their land management, particularly around building up their soil carbon, using much less fertilizer, using less pesticides, and so on. So they're our local champions, an example of one of our local champions. The value of collaborating and sharing experiences and know-how. So when we run our workshops and our forums, we do allow plenty of time for networking. Consistent approaches enhanced through working with core technical experts. It is important that report cards are underpinned by the best available evidence-based science. They need to stand up. They need to be robust. Because think of the pyramid. The top of the pyramid is only as good as what comes in underneath it. And a shared understanding of ownership of regional opportunities and challenges. So you can only do that through these regional report cards. You can never do that through the reef-wide report card process. It's not the purpose of it anyway. It's designed more as a government tool. So here's our report card. So here we have the catchments of the wet tropics. You probably know it's called the wet tropics because it's the wettest part of Australia. And Some parts of this area get up to 10 metres of rain a year in some of the upper catchment areas. Cassowary Coast averages around 4 metres of rain a year, so it's pretty wet country. You can see that the main catchments there are shown from the Daintree in the north down to the Herbert. The Herbert's our biggest catchment, but the upper Herbert actually is savanna country. It's not really wet tropics at all. It is included though, because it makes its way into the GBR lagoon, and it does have issues particularly around sediment erosion. So it's not really a hotspot for nutrients or pesticides or herbicides. It's more of a hotspot for sediment. So it's a bit more like the Burdekin river system in that regard. Here we've got the Barron, and we've got the Mulgrave, Russell River system here, and the Tully and so on. We've also got the various offshore zones as well, Hinchinbrook Channel, and we go down to just below Ingham, but we do include the Palm Island group offshore. Well, they're still kind of within the inshore environment, but they're off the coast of Ingham. So that's our area. This area is less than 1% of the area of Queensland in area. So actually quite small in area, but it's very significant in terms of agricultural production, but also in terms of the fact that half of this area is World Heritage Area. Plus the Great Barrier Reef offshore is also a World Heritage Area. Anyway, some of these zones I'll come back to later when So one of the things I said before is report cards are only as good as the science that goes into them, or social science that goes into them, or cultural science or cultural knowledge. So it's critical that you get that right. So what we try to do, we have a team of people, I'll show you the photos at the end. The report card, its role is to collate and analyse monitoring data in the waterways themselves and in the landscape, from a range of government, research and community sources. So some of it's from, as I said, is from citizen science, some of it's from local government, some state government, but also from universities and AIMS and CSIRO. We have a technical working group, and that essentially is shared across those 3 northern partnerships I mentioned. And that working group is comprised of experts in waterway health. It's multidisciplinary. They advise on the indicator development and methodology, and they review the data and results. You have to have that technical working group. On the other hand, you still have to work with the community. So it's a matter of toing and froing across that boundary. At the very high level, we have an independent science panel, and that conducts a final review of the method. So the people who make up the independent science panel would be some of the top people in their field, if not in Queensland, but in Australia. And they're experts from across the area of waterways and reefs and seagrass and all that sort of thing. They review the methods and results before the technical reports and the annual report card are published. So there is that kind of rigorous 2-level peer review. The technical working group, they tend to meet more often. They nut things out. They do the nuts and bolts. The independent science panel just do the final review. So they do it like a peer review of the report. So here's our report card from last year. We don't report on the year, but the same year that it's published in. So we report on the previous fiscal year. So we're reporting on 2019 to 20. The reason being it takes a good year or, well, a good 6 months at least to start getting the data together to do the analysis, plus all that technical side of things and review that I mentioned. So we can't report in real time at this stage. We also actually don't have a lot of money. We have to rely on a lot of data given to us from government agencies. We don't do our own private monitoring. We just don't have that kind of budget. But that's okay. So we report on that year, and you can see that this is the wet tropics. We've got the Daintree here on the right screen, and right down to Ingham down in the south. And we've got an influence in the south of the Burdekin River, particularly around sediments, but also the lower Burdekin, of course, is sugarcane. So there are some nutrient and pesticide issues there as well coming in from the Burdekin. because the onshore flow is from the southeast. So we get an onshore current coming up from the south. The offshore, though, is the East Australian current, which actually goes north to south, but not inshore, it's different. You can see we're reporting on the freshwater basins here. And remember that the score in the middle is the overall score. And this goes through to, and you won't see all the detail here. You're welcome to have a look at our report online. You can zoom in and have a look. These are the different indicators, just like I showed you with the Orinoco. Probably not as many in this report card. And you can see that, these scores are generally pretty good. Like the Tully's got a good score for fish. The Johnson is actually doing quite well here. Barron's not doing so well in some areas, particularly around water, not so much water quality, but some other measures, habitat, and particularly fish, for example. So you can see the Daintree gets an A because it's largely pristine. Not most of it hasn't been cleared for agriculture. So you kind of expect it to be doing well. We also say to our stakeholders that once you've got a B, the chance of you going to an A, you can do that in school. You probably can't do that in a river basin, mainly because you'd have to go back to it being pre-European state. So they would say goodbye to agriculture, completely revegetated. That's just not going to happen. What you've got to be worried about is if your grades go down. But if you can maintain your grades, then you should be happy with doing that. So some of these more agriculturally developed basins, they're never going to make an A. And that should not be seen as an issue. That's just the reality. You might also notice that we focus on some of the other drivers in the community, the economic growth, the population. We also nuance the climate in that particular fiscal year. So if we have a particularly wet year or particularly dry year, that can affect stream flow. So we need to nuance that in the report card as well. And you'll see that we then move to we've got the estuaries and we've got the offshore and inshore scores. And there are some, particularly in some areas, we're picking up some of the effects of the coral bleaching in 2016-17 in some of the coral scores. But for example, they're only a C for the offshore, where they should normally be at least an A. And that's because of the coral bleaching. And here we've got quite a low score for seagrass. And some of that is because the seagrass is still coming back from Cyclone Yasi back in 2011, where it got completely smashed up. So some of these grades and the scores behind them will move around a bit because of natural events like cyclones and coral bleaching. But of course, with coral bleaching, yes, it's a natural event, but climate change is actually making it more common. So it's starting to become a human-caused problem, not just a natural event. So that's something, I guess, to think about. So that's kind of how it works. And then for the first time in this report card, we reported on the urban water stewardship framework. As I said before, there's been a tendency perhaps for picking on farmers a bit. When, yes, there are urban areas in the wet tropics. Obviously, Cairns is the biggest urban centre, but we also have Innisfail and Ingham and other places as well. So therefore, what is happening in that kind of urban footprint? So we had an opportunity to work with all of the local government areas in the region, plus the 2 Aboriginal councils, Yarrabah and Wujal. And we don't show their individual scores here because that's confidential, but we do show an aggregate score. So for all of the wet tropics councils, they scored a C, which means they're just doing minimum practice for urban water stewardship. So clearly, this is where there is a case for possibly going from a C to a B. There is potential to improve that to current best practice. So that's something for them to work on. Each council got its own confidential report showing its own score, and some were naughty boys and some were good boys. It varied a bit across the councils. And again, it's something for them to take up and deal with. But we can't ignore the fact that the urban footprint is also impacting on the Great Barrier Reef as much as the agricultural footprint. And this is mainly around point source, but also the developing urban, and I guess the established urban areas as well. So the new developing areas have got much stricter regulations. Sorry, it went the wrong way. they've got much stricter regulations compared to the established areas. The point sources are your sewage farms, those sorts of things. So again, that's something if you're interested in that, just this is a new initiative from the Office of the Great Barrier Reef, and we'll probably do these frameworks every second year or so, so we can have a bit more of a focus on the urban footprint. Right, just a couple to finish off. Communication, again, coming back to the top of the pyramid, we work pretty hard at communication and within our budget, I guess. We have a podcast series. We're now up to season 3, episode 7, and that'll be kicking off in this year. Our new executive officer, James, who's listening tonight, is getting excited. He can't wait to get out and interview more people to produce some more of these podcasts. Again, I'll give you a link to the webpage if you want to have a listen to these a bit later on. They are really, really well done. You get to hear from all sorts of people who are basically living in the basin. They're working, they've got their farmers, they're people working in land care. There's all sorts of interesting stories going on across the catchment. We also have a news page where we provide media releases. So you can see we're focusing here on wetlands, citizen science. This is Mangrove Watch here. This is from a recent, I'll talk about this with another slide, but bringing people together for another science forum. We interview people because people are intrigued about mangroves. I think we've got 30 odd species of mangroves in the wet tropics. It might be 32. So it's a hotspot for mangroves. And this is an interview about the paddock monitoring in the wet tropics. So the kind of paddock to reef stuff. So that's some of the stuff that we try to do in terms of communication. And this is just a bit of a snapshot from our annual report. We distributed over 3,000 report cards. We did 15 media items, TV, radio, print, and podcast. We had unique email newsletter recipients. We held 15 different events in that financial year. Got 19 partners. We produced 47 documents. So, you know, people are certainly working pretty hard to communicate as much as they can, but obviously there's always more that you can do. Some recent activities from last year as we come out of COVID. We had another forum in November 2021, 2 years after the previous one. This was called Making Waves. And once again, it was more of a science forum, but we brought together scientists, environmental managers, and community groups. They heard from experts on the latest technologies and methods being used to address challenges affecting our waterways and reefs. So, for example, remote sensing, sensors on tractors in the paddocks, use of big data and sensor networks, some really, really interesting work going on in that kind of technology space that's leading to improvements in waterway stewardship. So that was, you can see the fellow in the screen there, he's obviously got a reef behind him. He's talking about some work that they're doing on the Great Barrier Reef. So that was really successful, and we feel these are worth doing at least every second year on a different topic, just to bring these different groups together. Last year, when we did our report card, we also released our Reef and Rivers magazine. And this is an initiative of our comms team to come up with a lifestyle and environment magazine. And this particular, we'll do our second edition this year in July. This focused on plastics, mangroves, Great Barrier Reef, waterside camping. And you can see here we try to make it a mixture of lifestyle, but also we try to have some good news stories about what people are doing to improve waterway health. So it has a focus on stewardship across that ridge to reef spectrum that I was talking about. So what's happening in the catchment, how that is a stewardship process that is hopefully improving water quality going out into the GBR lagoon. So again, that magazine can be accessed online if you want to read it as a online version of it. You can have a look at it. So I want to finish off by, first of all, I guess, thanking all of the partners in the partnership. This is our main partners, not all of them, but particularly those who give us, I guess, high-level sponsorship particularly the Queensland Australian Government and, of course, the councils, but also Terrain NRM, who is our host organisation. Without Terrain, we would have to find another host, and they are an excellent host for what we do. We do have a web page there, wettropicswaterways.org.au. Wet Tropics Waterways is one word. We also have a Facebook page. So if you're on Facebook, go in there and like us, please. And this is the operations team. These are the wonderful people who make my job as the chair so much easier because they organise everything for me. So I'm very grateful for that. I won't go through all of their names, but I just want to thank the operations team as well. And I'll leave it at that and thank everybody for listening to me this evening. Thank you. Back to you, John, I think.
Yep, all good. Thank you so much for that presentation.
I'll stop sharing, shall I? Yep.
Perfect. Okay. So, really fantastic overview and some brilliant details about how the whole process works. We've now got a bit of time for questions. More than happy if people want to hop onto the microphone and camera. Of course, you will be recorded. If not, you can put your question into the meeting chat. Do we have anyone willing to kick us off for tonight?
Do you want me just to read out some comments that might be useful?
Sure. Okay.
So Simon's given me a clap. Thank you, Simon. You're a nice man. Scott Wilson, thank you, Scott. The microplastic ingestion is about 5 grams per week. Okay, thank you for that. I got a bit carried away. It wasn't a whole credit card a week, but it might be that over a year, I guess. Okay, do you want to ask a question, Simon?
No, I don't want to ask any questions tonight. Steve just wanted to say good job, and I'm flattered that you used some of my material, so thank you.
You're very welcome. Where are you? Are you in Brisbane?
Yeah, I'm in Brisbane.
Okay, I thought you're not in the States. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for joining us, seeing you're one of the gurus.
That's fine. It's actually my uncle is a member of RGSQ and Neville McManam, and he said, "Oh, there's someone talking about marine things, and look at who it is." So happy to join. Thanks.
Would you like to join us? It's not very expensive.
Well, I want to hear some intelligent questions from the audience first, and then I'll make my decision.
Okay, thanks, Simon.
No.
Okay, it looks like we have a question in here from Rafni. Many thanks, Steve, for a tremendously clear and comprehensive explanation of the system. Such a lot of great work by you and all the team. Does the UNESC assessment utilise the report cards at all?
I think Rafni means UNESCO.
Yeah, UNESCO.
I meant UNESCO. Sorry.
Yeah, that's all right. The answer would be certainly, though, the reef-wide report cards would be made available. I mean, they're available online. Anybody can look at them. I don't think they'd so much look at the regional report cards, but they would certainly look at the 5-year outlook report, which is one reason why they, a decision, we were going to go on the endangered list, but then there was politics got involved and lots of money spent on private air travel or government jet by Minister Lloyd to go and try and overturn that decision. So the decision to overturn it was purely political. It wasn't based on any scientific basis. The actual scientists recommended the listing of the GBO on the endangered list. So the answer is yes, they will be looking at that, and they'll also be looking at, they'll be coming out in the first half of this year to do a site visit. That stuff can't be hidden from UNESCO. It's available for them to have a look at. They're more likely to look at that high-level science report of the outlook report, as well as the reef-wide report card. Yep. Good question. Thank you.
I think we've just got a comment there from Susan. Once again, thanking Steve for a clear and thorough presentation. Really enjoyed, learned a lot. Thank you for that comment, Susan.
Thank you, Susan, and thanks for joining us from over the border in New South Wales. Thank you.
Perfect. Do we have any other questions? Anyone want to? Oh, there we go. From Sylvia Clark. How do you convince stakeholders to join the partnership in the first place?
That's a good question. I guess one of the things that we have operations staff. So I mentioned young James before. I say young because he's younger than me, but he's not that young. His job is the executive officer. So he has to really, one of his roles is to go out seeking new partners. And we rely a little bit on word of mouth. We invite people to our report card launches. And in some cases, people want to be inside the tent because it's sometimes better to be inside the tent than you know what's going on. We find generally that we keep getting new partners all the time. You know, obviously we've got the big partners like, you know, the sugar industry, for example. We had the tourism industry, but they've really had a bit of a bad run, and that they've sort of can't afford to join at the moment, but they will come back in again once reef tourism comes back. But obviously, you know, the harbour board, so, you know, Ports North, who look after the Cairns Harbour, for example, Marillion Harbour, New Innisfail, they've got to be in there. So in some cases, it's kind of expected that they'll be in there. In other cases, we actually have people who are just interested in what we're doing. So we have local conservation groups, as I said, land care groups. We're working a lot more with traditional owners now. We're working with citizen science. So it's one of those things that kind of grows organically, and we're pretty happy with our membership, and we've got lots of small members. We just like to grow our membership a little bit more, who perhaps can contribute, but we actually don't need to bring in huge amounts of cash partners. So for example, we work with the Cairns Aquarium and the Cairns Airport. They give us in-kind support. The Cairns Aquarium is an excellent place for us to talk about stewardship initiatives, because huge numbers of kids go there every year from the local schools, plus lots of tourists, plus lots of locals. So they've got a massive database of people who go to that new Cairns Aquarium. So that's a great place for us to work, and we're very happy to that they've said they want to work with us. So that's an example, as is the airport as well, because that's where the tourists come in. So you catch people there. But again, I think that's an interesting question. It grows organically, and our membership's growing every year. So we must be doing something right.
Brilliant. We've got a question here from Scott Wilson. Do you review the indicators and consider adding or changing these, in particular in relation to emerging contaminants?
Yeah, Scott. We certainly, some of the, particularly around pesticides, new pesticides are added to the list all the time. And this is when you have to be careful about nuancing anything longitudinal. So, you know, you can't compare a report card from, say, 4 years ago when that particular contaminant was not included. So it has to be nuanced in that respect. You just make sure it's all about messaging. So the answer is, just answer the question, we are adding emerging contaminants all the time. We don't do PFAS at the moment. That's one that no one wants to talk about. But we're certainly adding more and more pesticides. And because more and more of those are coming out, others are being taken off the market, but obviously they remain in the system for quite a long time in some cases. In terms of reviewing the indicators, that is the role of the technical working group, and they do that fairly regularly, not just for existing indicators, but also for any new indicators that we bring in. So, for example, this last report card, we've added a freshwater fish indicator to all the basins now. The wet tropics has got the highest biodiversity of freshwater fishes in Australia. It's crazy that we didn't have freshwater fishes in our report card, but now we do. So we're adding stuff all the time. But the TWG, they tend to focus on those technical matters. That's their main purpose.
Steve, that's really fascinating about the tropical freshwater fish. Question here from Kerry Raymond. What kind of things can LGAs do to improve their scores? All
right, good old LGAs. I guess in particular, your LGAs, they're on a bit of a mixed footprint. So the more built up areas, you know, that you've got storm drains and those sorts of things. And as you get into the, you know, for example, Babinda is part of Cairns LGA, but Babinda itself is relatively rural. And you've got point source issues. So that's kind of where that urban water stewardship framework comes in as being very useful. But also Cairns Regional Council have a monitoring site on Saltwater Creek, where they are monitoring a whole lot of water quality attributes actually near the airport there. And that Saltwater Creek actually comes off an urban catchment or subcatchment. So that in itself is really interesting because there's no other examples of that that I'm aware of, certainly in the north anyway, where you're actually getting that sort of data from an urban footprint. So, but they're a big LGA, they've got plenty of money. It's harder we've got very small LGAs up north, like, Douglas Shire is very small population, small rate base. So, but they do some monitoring. I don't know whether they pay for it from another provider, but they do some monitoring in Dixon Inlet, which is near Port Douglas, and some of the other systems up there, Mossman River, and they do provide us with data. So, but in terms of what they can do in terms of stewardship, well, they need to, as I said, they need to look at that stewardship framework. They've got one for each of their own LGAs, and those who've got poor scores, that they need to think about ways of improving it. And a lot of that will just come down to money and how they're going to fund those things. And that is where they will probably need to turn to the state government for assistance to do that. It's not something they can do themselves. Also, there's lots of septic tanks all through those catchment areas. They've been there for many, many years, and we just don't really know what their contribution is. That's just a big unknown. It's the same here where I live on the Sunshine Coast from the hinterland, the septic tanks everywhere. We don't know what they're doing to the waterways. So again, these are things that LGAs have to start focusing on. Hope that answered the question.
And I thought that was a really good one. Thanks, Steve. And final one in the list here for tonight, and I'll probably fit quite well in terms of timings, from Michelle Neal. Is there a metric to measure how many citizen scientists contribute or number of hours?
No, but there should be, and I'll talk to you, Michelle. We know each other. So that's a good question. And I think that's something, I hope James is listening. So that's something he can follow up perhaps with you through ACSA, which is the Australian Citizen Science Association. That would be something, yeah, that's right. And we are building CSIRO are developing a whole bunch of social indicators for us to use as well. So we're starting, at the moment, you might notice that our report card is very ecologically, biophysically focused. We are starting to bring in some social indicators. We're bringing those into the next series of report cards. So clearly that's something we need to measure, and we can get all that data from all the citizen science groups working in the area that can provide us with that data. So thanks for that. And putting a dollar value, yes. Yep, we could do all of that. Again, you can help us. Thank you. All right.
All good. Well, we're rapidly approaching 8:45, so we might wrap it there for tonight. As always, if anyone else has any further questions, please send them through to the RGSQ mailbox. We're more than happy to forward them on to Steve and try and get those answers back to you for a very important topic, and obviously from someone with a lot of knowledge to answer all those types of questions. So once again, big thank you to Steve for putting this presentation together for tonight. I know I've certainly learned a hell of a lot, and I'm sure it's just generated more questions to ask Steve over the coming weeks and months. As always, as we mentioned at the start as well, if you aren't a member already of RGSQ, please consider signing up. We have a fantastic program of lectures currently planned for 2022, in addition to our rolling program of other activities, COVID safe and permitting, of course, that are set to happen over the coming weeks and months. So with that, everyone, we'll call it a night and look forward to seeing you virtually or in person very soon. Thanks.
Thanks, John.